Okay, guys, so we are going to start talking about the civil rights movement and the 1960s in general. And music is going to play a really, really huge role in the 1960s. The protest music about Vietnam is going to be a huge thing. Music inside of the civil rights movement, the women's movement, both of those are going to be pretty significant as well. So, yesterday, you were given the assignment to, first of all, watch a video clip of the KKK march. It was a march on Washington, D.C. in 1925. So the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan, has been around for a long time, actually. If you don't know that much about their history, the very first branch was founded in 1866. It was in Pulaski, Tennessee. And the KKK was actually formed by a group of Confederate soldiers who were protesting Reconstruction. Of course, after the South loses the Civil War and the Union gets all back together, a lot of changes happened in the South, and a lot of the people who were there obviously were protesting that. So the KKK is unfortunately going to turn into a very violent group who is going to aim their frustrations at the African Americans who are living primarily in the South at the time. So in 1925, you saw this march on this video clip. They say that there was 58,000 to 60,000 people who were actually marching, men and women. And so, just want to give you a little bit of background on the KKK because they are definitely going to play a very key role in a lot of the racial inequality that's going to happen in the South. The next thing, you were given a political cartoon that looks like a hand, and so it's basically asking you to identify on the fingers who's controlling the hand. Are the fingers part of the hand? Who's in control? Who's not in control? You also had an editorial, which was basically talking about some of these things. And so basically, when the newspaper, they took a very bold stance to be talking about this kind of thing. In fact, there were, I think, 10,000 Klansmen who lived in the town where this newspaper was published. So having such a strong stance against and basically calling out the people who are bribing and in charge of things and making sure that things don't work the way that they actually should. For a newspaper to do that in an area where there's 10,000 Klansmen was pretty bold for them. Of course, they end up winning a Pulitzer Prize for that, so it was a pretty intense thing. But definitely, that was one of those things that they worked on. So you also then had a handout that a link to a handout that talks about Jim Crow laws. So, Jim Crow laws are basically the laws that are put in place that legally separated the races in the South. So on your list, for example, it said that it was against the law for a college to put blacks and whites into the same school, and they could face financial fines for that. There was one that said blacks and whites couldn't live together as husband or wife, much less actually get married. You guys, like, it was in the law that you couldn't get married if one of you was black and one of you was white. And so these laws are known as Jim Crow laws. And over time, we actually find that the laws sort of take on this personification where we give people personal traits to inanimate objects, and people actually refer to Jim Crow like it was a person. Like, we can't do that because Jim Crow will get us, like he's the sheriff or something. So Jim Crow laws in place in the South, and so sometimes they were unspoken rules, things that you didn't talk about. Like, for example, you had to get off the sidewalk if you were a black person walking down the street and a white person came towards you on the sidewalk. It was your responsibility to step off onto the side, allow that person to pass you, and then you could continue on your way. That's not something that was written into a law, but it was definitely unspoken, and you still had to do it. So, there's a whole handful of different Jim Crow laws, unspoken and written down, that we could go through. if you've ever watched the movie The Help, I highly recommend it. It's a good film. The book is good. And they refer to Jim Crow multiple times in that movie, about different things that would affect them, basically as they were growing up and living during this time. So that's just a little bit of a background bit for you with the information that you were given yesterday. So we need to talk about the leadership and what's going on with the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement is a huge push to try and gain equal rights for blacks, particularly in the South, but they definitely wanted these federal laws to be put in place for everywhere. Don't get me wrong, there was very strong racism going on all over in the North, in California. Detroit burned to the ground in the 1960s because of some of the civil rights protests that were happening. The city was just on fire. So definitely there was a lot going on. I had a professor in college when I took a civil rights movement class. He was part of the movement in Detroit, which was absolutely fascinating. It was such a good person to have to just have that firsthand knowledge and experience. So inside the movement, probably the most likely person that you know was Martin Luther King Jr. He was in charge of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. King was in charge of this group that really promoted a nonviolent reaction to anything that was going wrong for them. He really wanted a peaceful protest. He really admired Mahatma Gandhi, who believed in nonviolence. He believed that you needed to really do everything through the law, make everything legal, and that violence was only going to really put a negative spin, a negative look onto the movement. And so Martin Luther King was definitely, I would say, probably the most likely one that you know. Andrew Young also worked with him very prominently. And again, the SCLC, they worked very hard for doing things through legal means. The next group that we are going to talk about is actually going to come out of California. That is the Black Panther group. So the Black Panthers, they are very much portrayed as being a violent group, but they aren't necessarily. I guess what I mean by that is that they were okay with violence as long as they were defending themselves. So the Black Panthers were formed by a couple of people named Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. Bobby Seale and Huey Newton really believed that they needed to work to protect their neighborhoods, particularly against police brutality. And so they formed this group. They were armed. Typically, you see them almost in like a military regalia. So they've got like the berets on their heads. They wore leather jackets. They almost always have a gun in their hand. But one of the keys is they taught people how to use them properly. And so when you see them, they're either pointed upwards or down towards the ground. They were taught to never point the gun at somebody unless they were going to fire. So it was basically a way to try and protect the people in these neighborhoods. They also form some soup kitchens, some after-school programs, try to keep the kids really off the streets, safe, make sure that they don't have any run-ins where they might actually see some of these police officers who then could treat them badly. So Huey Newton actually is going to get assassinated. Martin Luther King, of course, also assassinated. Huey Newton, they said that somebody inside the Black Panthers actually gave some information to the FBI, who actually are the ones who probably went after him. If you listen to Tupac, he has a song where he actually talks about that. He says, 2 shots in the dark, now Huey's dead. That's who he's referring to. So now that I've managed to bring up Tupac in the middle of a lecture. Our third group is the Black Muslims. So the Black Muslims were formed by Malcolm X. He did convert to Islam. He was a Muslim. This is in New York, just so that we can sort of see where like this spread is all throughout the country. We had a really large group in California, a really large group based in the South, and then of course Malcolm X in New York. Malcolm X had a totally different viewpoint on civil rights. He did not appreciate working with Martin Luther King most of the time because he was totally okay with violence. He thought that King was wasting time by not acting out and not being violent. And so he basically felt that violence was definitely an okay thing. He had a big push, a Back to Africa movement, that he thought that the Africans should be able to go back there. Of course, that would have been a little interesting since in the 1960s, none of them had lived in Africa. But he really thought that that was okay. So he did meet with Martin Luther King on several occasions, but like I said, they did not see eye to eye on how things worked out. So Malcolm X also assassinated, probably by members of the Nation of Islam, which was one of the groups that he had started with, but then he broke away and sort of formed the Black Muslims himself. So you are also going to get a timeline of segregation and integration and different things that happened in America. So 1896, so this goes way back. This was the first time that there was a court case ruling that said it was okay to separate the races. It's legal to do so, so long as everything that you have is equal. So this is where our separate but equal comes from. This is the Plessy versus Ferguson court case that said separate but equal. You can have separate schools as long as there's equal resources given to both of them. Of course, we know that that is definitely not how this happened. There was really no way that the black schools were equal to any of the white schools. In fact, in some places, they even did redistricting so that they would have all of the whites in one area and all the blacks in another. So the school district lines would be like all zigzaggy just to make those neighborhoods fit into where they wanted those schools to go. So that definitely was not equal, but that law is going to stand for quite a long time. So in 1952, we are going to have Brown versus Board of Ed. So this is another landmark case, basically, that is going to, after 2 years, I think it takes 2 full years for this to go through the court system, but it will overturn that 1896 ruling and said, you cannot do this. You cannot have separate but equal. It's not fair. It's not legal anymore. So once separate but equal goes away, it basically opens the door and says that all of these schools have to integrate. We did see, again, redistricting would happen, so then they could still turn people away. They're like, nope, you don't live in our district, sorry. But this is when we'll start to see some other major cases that are going to go down. So if you've ever seen the movie about Ruby Bridges, for example, she's this little girl, like kindergarten or first grade, I think, that it was the first one to integrate into a school, and none of the teachers would teach her, and she was in a classroom all by herself. And so there's several other instances like this. The Little Rock Nine. So this one is 1957, and this is from Central High School in Arkansas. These were 9 students who were very specifically chosen, 9 black students, very, very specifically chosen. They were bright, they were smart, they got good grades, and they were chosen to be the ones to integrate in at Central High School. They're in Arkansas. It was horrible for them. When they arrived at the school, people were just lining the sidewalks. They screamed at them. They spit at them. They threw things at them. And you have to really try to imagine, like, being the first one to do this, and they're just teenagers. They're just your age, and they're doing this absolutely remarkable historic thing. And so it was really hard, and in the end, the 101st Airborne actually had to come in and protect them, basically on that walk to school every day. The 101st is If you've ever seen Band of Brothers, they're the 101st Airborne. So they fought that division in World War II. And so they were actually used to protect the Little Rock Nine there. The University of Alabama. This one is actually, you see this in Forrest Gump if you have watched that one. 1963. So this is about a decade after Brown versus Board of Ed. We have Vivian Malone and James Hood. They are trying to integrate into the University of Alabama, which by law they should have been allowed to do. Governor Wallace. So the governor there of Alabama actually got in the way, stood in the doorway of the school and refused to let them come through. So obviously he was like, this is not going to happen. So he eventually, the National Guard got sent by John Kennedy, and they were allowed to enter that building and register for classes for the summer. Kennedy, of course, is going to be assassinated in November of 1963. And in 1964, the Civil Rights Act is going to get passed. So this is very likely something that Kennedy was working very hard on, but Johnson is the one who ends up signing this in 1964. Kennedy was an ally of the Civil Rights Movement. He met with Martin Luther King multiple times, was absolutely just disgusted to see some of the violence, some of the things that were going on in Birmingham, for example, we'll talk about a little bit later. Hated it, hated that this was happening. Johnson came from Texas, where racism was pretty strong, but he did do a lot for the Civil Rights Movement. I just don't know how much of that was him personally or how much of that was political gain. So in the end, that's just a short timeline. So I'm going to go ahead and post that timeline for you guys so that you can have that, and it'll go along with this video. And then we are going to be focusing on the music that was actually in the Civil Rights Movement and how the people used it. So at the protest marches, the Freedom Riders, even going down to Martin Luther King's funeral and the songs that were played that people still associate with him. So it's pretty powerful, and we will start listening to some music very soon. See you guys later.